Have you ever been plagued by the feeling that the world around you is whispering, urging you on towards something you would be better off avoiding? It is that feeling I had in that small town I found myself in, chasing a project in photography. Abandoned places are a weakness of mine. I shoot their last breaths on film. And as I sat in some quiet cafe, sipping my coffee and scrolling through local news for ideas, it cropped up a name whispered. Locals at the table next to mine whispered about the cursed motel on the outskirts of town. Their voices were barely louder than a whisper, but the edge of fear was unmistakable. I caught a few words: disappearances, shadow, and one woman muttered something that sent a shiver down my spine. It keeps those who can't see their reflection. It was only a line, perhaps superstition. But it was enough to raise my curiosity. Before I knew it, I had overheard the bulk of the story. That motel in the 60s had been a hot spot, but then something happened, something the locals would not discuss in detail. People started over time to vanish. Word on the street had it that if you stayed too long, the motel wouldn't let you leave. They were attracted to it as moths to a flame, some sense of dread holding them close. Whether it was the thrill of the story or my eagerness for the perfect shots, I decided to check it out. When I got up to leave, the cafe owner, Claire, tried to stop me, a hint of worry in her eyes. "Be careful," she warned softly, as if she knew something I didn't. "Some things are best left alone." While driving to the motel, Claire's words kept ringing in my head, an alarm that really should have stopped me in my tracks, but my mind was riveted by that shot-perfect image framed against an eerie history. The trees that bordered the road to the motel were twisted, their branches arching overhead like bony fingers, blocking out most of the sun. Then, the motel itself came into view, and that feeling of excitement mixed with apprehension. It was just the way I'd envisioned it, old, decaying, a relic of another time. The paint on the walls was cracked and peeling, while broken windows seemed to watch me, empty and hollow. I parked the car and picked up my camera, stepping out into the quiet. The site was silent, eerily so, no trees rustling, no birds, just a heavy, almost unnatural quiet. I walked closer, and through the trees saw the front. A rusted sign swayed faintly in the breeze. Hillview Motel. A shiver crept up my spine, but I pushed it aside. I'd taken pictures of dozens of abandoned buildings before. This was no different. Or so I told myself. I started to snap off pictures of the facade crumbling, of the way the shadows fell against the wall. The air felt thicker here, as if the building itself was breathing. I circled the perimeter, searching out interesting angles, but every time I glanced toward one of the windows, I could have sworn I saw movement out of the corner of my eye. When I got to the main entrance, I felt a hesitation. My hand hovered over the door, and I could see that it was a little bit ajar, as if someone had just slipped inside. I pushed it open, the hinges groaned, their protest echoing down the empty hallway. Inside, it smelled of mold and stale air. Dust danced in the shafts of light that filtered through the cracked windows, illuminating relics left forgotten by times gone by. There was an old reception desk in the middle, still with keys on a pegboard behind it, each one labeled with a faded room number. The silence, though, was oppressive, pushing down upon me with an almost stifling weight. I started down the hall, the floor creaking under my feet. Each door stood open a crack, it seemed, waiting for someone to enter. I raised the camera, shot after shot of the dark hallway and empty rooms beyond. And then, as I turned a corner, I froze. There, at the far end of the corridor below me, a figure stood, a dark form in silhouette, perfectly still, facing away from me. My pounding heart catching in my chest, I lowered my camera. I blinked, and the figure vanished, of course, as if it had just been a trick of the light. I breathed unsteadily, the feeling evasive, and then convinced myself that my mind was playing tricks on me, but that feeling stayed there, that I wasn't alone. And in that moment, I couldn't shake off the feeling that in turn, the motel watched me. The air was thick now, as if the building leaned on me from every side. That figure standing at the end of the hall wasn't anywhere to be seen, but that feeling it had left clung on to me. I kept telling myself it was just an illusion, some sort of flicker of light in this old abandoned building, but somewhere inside, I knew it wasn't that. I took a deep breath and continued down the hall, the camera hanging around my neck like a dead weight. Every step felt labored, the silence around me heavy and oppressive. My mind began replaying Claire's words at the cafe, that warning some things were best left alone. Part of me had regretted coming here, but part of me was not willing to turn back, the part of me which was led by curiosity, the kick of capturing the unknown. As I ventured deeper into the motel, hallways extended, curled, and twisted in manners and directions that were quite unlooked for. It almost feels like the building shifts, tugs, and pulls me further inside, away from the protection of the exit. I feel eyes upon me, someone or something literally following me but out of sight. I tried diverting my attention towards the details of the place. Old furniture, covered with dust scattered here and there, remnants of a time when this motel might have been full of life. Faint stains on the carpet, markings on the walls, and an occasional echo that sounded suspiciously like footsteps. I moved my eyes, scanning every shadow, every flicker of light, and nothing was amiss until I caught sight of a door, almost at the end of the hall, standing a little ajar. The number was on the door, 12, but it was chipped and faded. There was just something about it that felt wrong. It was colder as I stepped closer to it, the silence around me growing louder with every step. I couldn't explain it, but my instincts were screaming at me to stay away from that room. But of course, I didn't listen. I slowly pushed the creaky door open, the hinges whined in protest. Inside, the room was dark, only a sliver of light from the hall to illuminate the dusty floor. I stepped inside, raising my camera, taking a few cautious shots. The flash illuminated the room for a brief second, a bed, an old dresser, and a broken mirror hanging on the wall. I froze, the reflection of myself staring back from the shattered glass. For a moment, I could have sworn that there was something else in the mirror, some dark shape just standing behind me. I whirled around, my heart pounding against my chest, but the room was quite empty. Just me, alone in the stale, musty air. I turned back to the mirror and stared into the fractured glass. My reflection stared back, distorted, fragmented, just about unrecognizable. It was as if I were staring at a stranger, someone with hollow eyes and a haunted look. I tried to laugh it off, but the sound died in my throat when a very soft whisper filled the room. "Leave." The voice was soft, little more than a whisper, but it seemed all it took to make my blood run cold. I turned to each side, trying to find another person in this vicinity, but nobody showed up. Only the shadows and oppressive, maniacal silence weighed down on me. I took one step back, my heart clambering in my chest. I did not know what I heard, maybe the wind, or my mind playing tricks on me. Still, something about that whisper felt so real, almost like a warning. I stumbled backward into the hall, gasping. The door of room 12 swung shut behind me with a loud bang. The sound echoed down the empty hall. I didn't look back, I couldn't. Instead, I forced myself to keep on going, trying to shake off the feeling that something was following me. Something was off as I made my way back toward the lobby. The motel felt off. Shadows were darker, denser, and seemed to be alive, watching me from corners of the room. The walls seemed closer, and every hallway I passed looked exactly the same, like the motel was trying to keep me from finding my way out. Just when I really felt utterly lost, I saw up ahead of me the reception desk. The relief that welled up in me made me walk faster, anxious to get back with my car. But once I reached the lobby, I stopped cold. Behind the reception desk, there was an old man. Hunched over, his back to me, sorting through a pile of old yellowed papers. I hadn't seen anyone else when I came in, and this man was. Well, at the very least, he was an unsettling sudden appearance. I cleared my throat in hopes of getting his attention. "Excuse me," I called out, my voice little more than a whisper. The man didn't say anything, just continued to shuffle the papers. His movements were labored and slow. I tried again, louder this time. "Hello?" Still, there was no response. I felt a chill run up my spine as I walked to the desk, the hairs on the back of my neck standing on end. The man's hand stopped, his fingers hovering over one of the papers. Then, with measured slowness, he turned to face me. His eyes were vacant, empty, as if he stared right through me. His skin was pale, almost ghostly, with a faint and unsettling smile upon his lips. "You shouldn't be here," he rasped in a very low tone of voice. "This place. It keeps what it takes." I had opened my mouth to reply, but nothing had come out. It was as if the man's gaze could cut through me, and in that fraction of a second, I'd felt a faint presence of pure dread, as if one was standing on the edge of something black and endless. I didn't know what he meant, but I didn't need to. I turned and bolted for the door, the blood pounding in my ears. As I pushed through the lobby doors and out into the open air, I didn't dare look back. I didn't stop running until I reached my car, the cold night air filling my lungs as I fumbled with my keys. My hands shook all over, every nerve in my body screaming at me to get out of there. I'd been in abandoned places a million times before, but this was different. That old man's words still echoed in my head, sending chills down my spine. This place. It keeps what it takes. I finally started the car, clung to the wheel tight, and tore down the empty road back towards the town. But even as I drove, I could not kick off the feeling that I was not alone, the possible presence of something in the back seat, quietly watching. I really made myself be on the road, telling myself it is my mind again. Yet, all shadows appeared darker, every sound was louder, until the lights of this town finally showed up. Only then did I start breathing normally again. The other morning, though so tired, I couldn't shake off what had happened. I replayed everything in my mind, that whisper in room 12, that strange shadow in the mirror, the empty gaze of that man. It haunted me, it was a fragment in my brain, not letting go. I wanted answers, needed them, however much that meant going back. I went back to the cafe in hopes of seeing Claire, the woman that had told me about the motel in the first place. Maybe she knew something more, something which could make some sense of it all. I found her behind the counter at the cafe, her face lighting up when she saw me, though the expression quickly faded when she caught sight of my face. "You went there, didn't you?" she half whispered. She stared at me as if she had seen a ghost, and for the briefest of moments, I felt like one. I nodded slowly. Something strange is going on in that place. I don't know how to tell, but it's alive somehow. She didn't look surprised, just saddened. "You're not the first to say that," she said with a murmur, looking around the desolate cafe. "There's a reason people avoid that motel. Folks around here say it's a place between places. A place that draws people in, especially those with questions." "A place between places?" I echoed, unsure of what she meant. She let out a heavy, resigned sigh, folding her arms and leaning against the counter. "The kind of people who go in are, more often than not, looking for something. Answers. Meaning. Closure. That place knows, latches on. It gives them what they are looking for. But it always takes something in return." Her words sent a shiver down my spine. I'd gone there in search of stories, to capture the last echoes of life in that place. But maybe, on some deep level, I was looking for more than that, a way to see beyond the surface, to catch a glimpse of something extraordinary. Claire set a hand on my arm, an urgent sobering on her face. "Leave it alone," she said in a low tone. "People that go back there, they aren't the same when they get out. Some never come out at all." Her warning stuck with me as I left the cafe, but that didn't quite cut it. I'd been drawn to the motel for a reason, and leaving without answers felt wrong. Like a door left open, waiting for me to step through. I went against every instinct when I found myself driving back toward the motel that night. The sun had dipped below the horizon, casting long shadows across the road. It was silent, almost expectant, when I finally got there, as if it had waited all those years for my return. I stood outside for the longest time, and this flashing image of an old man's face dancing in my mind. The air was heavy and thick with something weighty, something unnamed and gnawing, but I'd come this far now, and there was to be no turning back. I stepped inside. My footsteps were echoing in that empty lobby. The lights above flickered faintly, casting strange, twisted shadows on the walls. It felt different this time, more sinister. In the hours I'd been gone, even the motel seemed to have grown. I made my way back to room 12, my heart pounding inside my chest. The door was closed, but something inside just pushed me forward to some pull I could not resist. I reached for the doorknob, and the cold metal sent a shiver up my arm as I pushed it open. The room was as I had left it: broken mirror, dusty bed, eerie silence. Only something else was there now, something that I hadn't taken with me the first time into memory. In the corner, there was a small notebook lying on the floor, its cover faded and worn. I picked it up, flipping through the yellowed pages filled with messy, frantic handwriting. The entries were dated from years ago, each page filled with scribbles and notes, sketches of the motel, and one phrase repeated over and over: "It's not what it seems." He wrote about strange happenings, like whispers, shadows that moved of their own accord, rooms that would appear and then disappear in a trice. Almost in a way, I felt that he too was a victim of the same things I were. The deeper I read, the deeper into this motel web I felt myself being pulled. One entry, in shaky letters, stood out to me. "If you are reading this, you need to leave. The motel, it feeds on something inside of you. Every time you stay, it takes a piece. You won't feel it at first, but soon you'll start to see things that aren't real, things that aren't possible." A cold shiver ran down my spine as I read those words. That sounded terrifying, that this motel would take something from me, something immaterial yet vital. Of late, since my first visit, I'd had a feeling that pieces of my memory were slipping, little details I couldn't quite remember. As I stared at the page, a flicker of movement in the broken mirror had caught my eye. I looked up, and there in the shattered glass was my own reflection. But it wasn't right. The figure staring back at me was me, yet not me. The eyes were hollow, the skin pale, like some twisted version of myself. I stumbled backward, and the notebook fell from my hands, while the reflection in the mirror began to smile, a slow, unnatural grin that washed a wave of nausea through me. I turned to leave, but as I reached the door, I saw him again. The old man from the reception was standing in the hallway, watching me. "You're part of it now," he whispered. "You can't leave. Not until it decides you're done." The room spun then, the walls seeming to close in, the air thick and heavy, suffocating. Panic surged through me, but my feet felt rooted to the spot, unable to move, unable to flee. I knew right then and there, the motel wasn't just a building, it was alive, and it had me in its grasp. I can hardly recall how I came out of that room, how I reached the lobby. All that flashed within my mind was that I had to be out, to run away from the smothering darkness at every corner of the place. By some miracle, I staggered back toward my car. My heart was pounding, cold skin touched by fear. I slammed the door, turned the key in the ignition, and went down that empty, twisting road as fast as possible, away from the motel that seemed to swallow night itself. Even while I did well to leave that building behind, this being watched would not let go, the eyes invisible and following my every move. The reflection, the one twistedly me with hollow eyes and a jackalish grin, flashed into my mind. And I couldn't shake the feeling that I was leaving a part of myself in that room, trapped within the invisible grasp of the motel. Days blurred, and I was staying in town, afraid to go further, unable to concentrate on anything else except for this motel and some strange, vital power it seemed to possess. I found myself going through the photos I took, and every time I looked into them, they felt wrong. The angles were slightly off, the shadows too deep, as if the motel had warped the images somehow, bending them to its own twisted design. One night, I was sitting in a small inn on the outskirts of town in my room, staring at my camera. My phone buzzed on the table next to me, and I glanced down to see that it was an unknown number calling. A part of me wanted to ignore it completely, yet an instinct told me otherwise. I picked up the phone, my voice shaky. "Hello?" Silence on the other end of the line, except for light, shallow breathing. Then, a voice, low, almost whispering, but undeniably familiar. "You shouldn't have come back." It was the voice of the old man from the motel. My blood ran cold, every muscle tense. Who are you?" I managed to ask, barely audible. It was one of those silences, thick, suffocating. He spoke again, words came slow and deliberate, each one waited to land deep into my bones. "It's not about me. It's about you. The motel has seen you now, and it doesn't forget." The line went dead, and I was left standing there clutching the phone, my heart pounding in my chest. Still shaking, I set it down, my head racing with questions. What did he mean, the motel doesn't forget? Wasn't I gone? Wasn't I free? Yet somehow, deep inside, I knew it was not that simple. I tried to get on with my day as if everything were normal, but there was this invisible pullback. I'd sit in the cafe, attempting to read or do some sketching, but my mind was constantly wandering back to the motel. It became impossible to avoid, visions of dark hallways, shadowy corners, and unnatural silence wrapping my mind. I didn't sleep a wink that night. Lying in bed, staring up to the ceiling, my mind played tricks on me, with haunting images of my reflection in that broken mirror. It was as if it still watched me, awaiting my return. With a flick of the switch, my bedside lamp went on, though little good its comforting light did, casting long, ominous shadows against the walls that seemed to shift and move. Just when I thought I might fall asleep, I heard a soft tap 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 against the window. My heart missed a beat as I sat up and listened. The noise was slight but regular, like someone lightly tapping his knuckles against the glass. I held my breath, afraid to move, afraid of what I might see if I looked. And the tapping continued. With each sound, I was pulled closer to the edge of panic. I had to look. I knew it was a terrible idea, but something compelled me to check if the nightmare was real. I turned my head, thus, my gaze moved toward the window. And then, there it was, a figure, standing just outside the glass, a dark silhouette hardly visible in the dim light. Its face was obscured, but I could see the outline of a hand pressed against the window, its fingers splayed in a way both human and wrong. It didn't move, didn't make a sound besides the soft tapping of its fingers against the glass. I sat paralyzed with fear, unable to wrench my eyes away. Then, as if it sensed my fear, the figure moved closer, its face coming into focus. It was me, or rather, the twisted, hollow-eyed version of me I'd seen in the motel mirror. That unsettling smile oozed across its face, the same smile I'd seen before, and a wave of nausea washed over me. In an instant, I blinked, and he was gone. Only the window stood, emptied out, reflecting a dim light from inside. I sat there for a very long time, feeling my heart race and my skin grow clammy with fear. I knew at that moment the motel hadn't let me go, it had followed me, or maybe it had just left a part of itself inside me, a seed of darkness that was now growing and entwining my mind. The next morning, I went back into the cafe. Claire was already inside, and her eyes were wide as normal upon seeing me. I must have looked pale, exhausted, on the edge of collapse. She sat me down and poured me a cup of coffee, waiting for me to speak. "It followed me," I whispered into the cup. "I left, but it's still there. Watching. Waiting." She leaned forward and placed a hand on mine, her eyes quiet and resignedly sad. "Some places don't let go, not fully. They cling to those they find interesting. I shivered, her words sending a chill through me. What do I do? I asked, barely able to keep the fear from my voice. Claire snorted, glancing around as though she feared someone would overhear them. I don't know. But maybe there's something it wants. Something it's looking for in you. Until you figure out what that is, it won't stop. I didn't know what she meant, but as I left the cafe her words stuck. The idea that the motel had chosen me, that it wanted something from me terrifying. Still, an answer was exactly what I needed. And I couldn't continue on like this, shadow-haunted, whisper-haunted, haunted by a version of myself that wasn't quite me. I made my decision with a mix of fear and determination. I was going to go back to the motel one last time to face whatever would await me there, face whatever darkness had so taken hold of me. And as the sun began to set and I got into my car, a part of me wondered if I'd ever come back. The drive back toward the motel was as though passing into the realm of a nightmare. The sun had set, casting blood-red shadows across the road. Every mile that slipped by thickened the air, weighted it, as if the darkness itself were compacting, an unseen vice closing in. The picture of that twisted version of myself tapped into my mind, tapping on my window, like a warning I chose to ignore. The motel came into view a little after nightfall, looming in the distance as a silhouette against the darkening sky. It was quiet, too quiet, a silence that presses against your ears until you can hear your own heartbeat. I parked the car, keeping the engine running for a second while I had second thoughts about turning back. But the motel seemed to draw me in, like some magnetic force that I could not help myself from feeling. I cut the engine, stepped out of the truck and stood staring upwards at the building, its shape vague in the dark. It was exactly as I'd left it, yet it was something different. The air was colder, almost freezing now, and a fine mist clung to the ground, tangling around my feet as I made my way across to the front doors. As I entered inside, that same old smell of mold and staleness reached my nostrils, but this time it was so much more suffocating, as if the building itself had come alive. The lights above sputtered and flashed, irregular short flashes of light dancing across the wall in changing shadows. I made myself push on, every step clattering through the corridor like the pulse of a heart. I walked towards room 12, the door was ajar, as if waiting for me. My hand hovering over the doorknob, a knot forming in my stomach, I pushed it open and stepped inside. The room was empty, just as I had left it. The broken mirror still hung on the wall, reflecting fragmented pieces of the room, and for a moment, I saw my reflection again, twisted, hollow-eyed, smiling. I looked away, making myself breathe, focus. I had come here for a reason. I needed answers, needed to understand what this place wanted from me. Turning back into the room, I caught something on the floor, that notebook I found during my last visit, filled with frantic entries warning of this motel's power. I picked it up, flipped through the pages, skimming over so many of the same lines I'd read before. There was a final entry this time, new, which hadn't been there. It had been written in some scrawly handwriting that was barely readable, but I could manage to decipher the words. To leave, you have to find the heart of the motel. The place where it all began. A chill crawled down my spine. The heart of the motel? I had no idea what that could mean, but the words seemed to throb in my mind, a message left by some other person who'd been stuck here, a person maybe who knew the way out. I stepped out into the hall, clenching the notebook tightly. The motel seemed to shift around me, the walls stretching and constricting as I made my way down the corridors. Every now and again, I'd catch a glimpse of something shadowy out of the corner of my eye, hear muffled footsteps echoing through the vacant rooms. And I couldn't shake off the general feeling that I wasn't alone, that the motel was watching, guiding me towards something I couldn't yet see. As I walked deeper into the building, the more I began to notice things which hadn't been there, my first time through, doors that weren't there, twisted hallways which seemed to loop back upon themselves, leading me in wide circles. It was as if the motel was alive, reshaping itself to keep me inside. After what felt like hours of meandering, I came upon a downward staircase. It was weird, I hadn't seen a basement on the motel schematics when I'd researched the place. Yet something about it all felt fateful, like this was the path I was supposed to take. I patted down, the echo of my footsteps off the cold concrete walls. With every step, it got colder. By the time I reached the bottom, I could see my breath in the faint light. The hall was small, lined on either side with doors, each bearing a room number I wasn't familiar with. Older, much older, than the motel upstairs, like they had been closed off and not used in decades. I moved cautiously, feeling my way down the hall, but stopped when something too faint to call a whisper reached my ears. It was coming from room B13. The door was open a bit, a soft cold light spilling into the hall. I hesitated, every single instinct inside me screaming to turn back, to leave. But it was already too late for that. I simply couldn't leave without knowing what was behind that door. I pushed it open and stepped inside. The overwhelming feeling of cold was a chill right to the bone. The room was completely empty except for a single chair in the center, facing an old, cracked mirror propped against the far wall. The mirror looked ancient, its surface cloudy and scratched, but as I stared into it, something pulled me closer. My reflection stared back, but this time it didn't move with me. It just stayed there, watching, almost as if it was waiting for my first move. The eyes that used to be so twisted and hollow were gone. It looked just like me, tired, afraid. But something in its gaze, well, it felt all too familiar and foreign at the same time. Then, the reflection spoke. "You know why you're here," it whispered, an echo of my own voice. "This place, it's part of you now." I shook my head, not letting my gaze falter. "I just wanted to take pictures, to capture, to understand." My reflection's eyes filled with darkness, and a look of pity crossed its features. "You wanted more than that. This place found what you were looking for, what you didn't even know you needed." "What does that mean?" My voice was small, hollow, lost. The reflection held my gaze with unrelenting intensity. "You have seen things that you should not have. Things which exist only in the spaces between. And now, they are a part of you." As it spoke, the mirror seemed to ripple, the surface distorting as the reflection reached out and pressed its hand to the glass. I stared, frozen, while my own hand moved of its own accord toward the glass, feeling an unnatural pull toward the cold, hard surface. The instant my fingers touched the mirror, I felt a wave of pain run through me, a cold that seeped into every vein, every nerve. I yelped, the sudden movement jerking my hand back, but the reflection's hand remained pressed against the glass, those hollow eyes and twisted smile appearing again. "You can't leave," it whispered. "Not until the motel is done with you." I stumbled back, my vision blurring and the room spinning around me. In the mirror, the reflection in it twisted from my face to something darker, something inhuman. Shadows turned up at the corners of the rooms, whispering, closing in, and the sound of footsteps echoed down the hall, growing louder. I turned, stumbling out of the room and back into the hallway, and that cold clung to my skin like a bruise. I had to get out, had to escape before the motel swallowed me whole. Up the stairs I went, the pounding of my heart in my ears, the shadows chasing me, pulling at me, trying to drag me back. By the time I hit the lobby, I was gasping for breath, with the walls threatening to close in on me. I burst through the front doors and out into the night, the cold air slapping me back into reality. Still, as I stood out there, huffing and exhausted, I knew it wasn't over. The motel still lay inside me, the whispers that went on inside my mind, a piece of darkness that had grown roots. And as I turned back to the building, its windows mute and dark, I knew I would never be free. For now, the motel was part of me, and I of it. I put it in drive and headed back to town, my knuckles white from gripping the wheel so tightly, trying to normalize my breathing, reassure myself now that I was free. Yet, this feeling would stay with me, a gnawing kind of emptiness that seemed impossible to rid myself of. A part of me had remained at the motel, the shadows I'd left seemed to trail after me. Back in my small inn room, I tried piecing together the events of everything, the strange encounters, the mirror, the shadowy reflection that looked and sounded like me but was undeniably not me. The warning of the notebook haunted my mind: to leave, you must find the heart of the motel. And in that basement room, I'd thought I'd found it, but whatever that mirror had shown me, it hadn't been the end. If anything, it felt like the beginning of something darker, deeper. I sat on the bed, looking at the faint pattern of the wallpaper, lost in my thoughts. I barely noticed the time slipping by, then looked at my wristwatch and saw it was 3:13 a.m. The late hour didn't faze me, but something about those numbers caused my heart to speed up. In 2 minutes, it would be 3:15. I shook my head, trying to shake the feeling, but as the seconds ticked closer and closer, a sound I had once heard before finally landed upon my ears: the faint tap-tap-tap against the window. I froze, catching my breath in my throat, the hairs on the back of my neck standing on end. I turned slowly, my gaze going to the window, and there it was again, my reflection, yet not me. Hollow eyes, the same curled smile, but different, too. Watching me with a coldness that ran chills down into my marrow. It was the same reflection I'd seen in the motel. Somehow, it had followed me here. It cocked its head to one side, studying me, then mouthed a single word I couldn't hear but understood all too clearly. Return. I stepped backward, my heart racing. I had left the motel, hadn't I? Yet here it was, pulling me back, some kind of puppet with me on invisible strings. Cold seeped through the room, wrapping itself around me and filling me with a dread I couldn't shake. Then and there, I knew I couldn't turn my back on it, couldn't run away from it. Whatever happened in that motel wasn't over yet. I might have walked away, but it hadn't let me go. I knew with a sense of sinking that I had no choice, I had to return. Unless I wanted to free myself from this darkness, I had to go against it, to face whatever was waiting in the shadows. The drive back was surreal, a motion at the edge of a nightmare from which I couldn't wake. The road now felt longer, stretching into darkness beyond, as if the motel was farther away now than it had been before, hiding and waiting for me to draw closer. By the time I reached it, the break of dawn was in process, casting an eerie glow over the crumbling exterior. I parked and stepped out. Morning lay thick and still around me, every sound muffled, it would seem, as the world itself was holding its breath. The motel loomed ahead in silence and expectation. And I could feel it, a tug, an imperative not to be denied. Inside, the air was dead, thick, choking, the quiet more final than before. The lobby was empty, just the way I had left it, but something in the air was different. It was as if the motel knew I had returned. I pushed myself on down the hall that had twisted and lengthened on its last circuit, every step racketing loud against the stillness. I feel myself being pulled back to room 12, though every fiber of my body screams to turn around, to leave. The door was ajar, waiting for me. I pushed it open and stepped inside. The room was deserted, the broken mirror hung crookedly from the wall, but it was even colder than it had been before. A sense of dread settled over me, thick and suffocating, the instant I stepped inside. I turned to the mirror, expecting to see my twisted reflection, but this time, it was just me. Closer, peering at my own face, searching for that hollow-eyed figure that had haunted me. But it wasn't there. It was just my face, tired, pale, and scared. And then, I heard it, a faint whisper, so soft it could have been mistaken for a gentle breeze. Yet I knew better. The voice seemed to come from everywhere around me, echoing off the walls of the room, filling the space with the low, haunting tone. Welcome back. I spun around, peering into the darkness for the owner of the voice, but the room was deserted. The door behind me had shut of its own accord and sealed me inside. A wave of panic rushed through me, but I clamped down on it, hard. I had come for answers, and I wasn't leaving until I had them. This voice whispered from deep within the motel's walls and became both so familiar and so foreign to me, as if part of myself I had left behind. You wanted to know, so come and see. The mirror flickered and my reflection shifted, twisting into that hollow-eyed version of myself, its expression blank and unfeeling. It started to raise a hand, very deliberately, and it pointed toward the far wall of the room. As this happened, wallpaper peeled back, showing something underneath. I moved closer, transfixed by the place, and watched as the wallpaper crumbled away to reveal the door, a small narrow door hidden in the wall. As my heart rushed with excitement, I reached for the handle, feeling the cold metal under my fingers. I opened the heavy door with its loud creaks and stepped inside into a narrow passageway. The air was thick and stale, carrying a scent of decay. Linings of old, faded photos donned the walls, each showing faces that were alien to me, men, women, and children, all of them with sunken eyes and twisted smiles. This hallway just seemed to go on, deeper into the heart of the motel. The whispers got louder as I walked, swirling around me, filling my head until it was hard to think. There was a door at the end of the hall, and I knew beyond all doubt this was the way the motel wanted me to go. My hand shook as I went to grasp the handle. For one bright moment, I wavered and the weight of fear pressed down upon me. But there was no turning back. I opened the door and stepped inside, finding myself in a room unlike anything I had ever seen. The walls were lined with mirrors, each showed different angles of the room, creating an endless maze of reflections. And in each mirror, I saw them versions of myself, twisted and hollow-eyed, watching me with that same unnerving smile. Standing in the center of the room was the old man I had seen before, his face pale and expressionless. He turned towards me now, and his eyes were as empty as an abandoned well, yet brimmed with a cold intelligence. "You asked for answers," he whispered, his voice carrying across the room. "Now, you must accept them." The mirrors began to shake, the reflections stirred of their own accord, stretched out, hands placed flat against the glass, as if trying to break free. I felt a cold sweat well up on my skin, the air thick with something dark and ancient. What do you want from me?" I managed to utter, hardly audible. The old man's smile was thin, almost pitiless. "The motel doesn't want. It takes pieces of those that come here. You came looking for something, and now you must leave something behind." I took one step back, my heart pounding, the walls closing in as the reflections started to move, stepping closer, reaching out, their hollow eyes fixed on me. "Wait, what are you talking about? What do you mean, leave something behind?" But there was no answer, only the cold, silent stare of my twisted reflections closing in around me, the air growing colder and heavier until it felt like I couldn't breathe. And as the darkness closed in, I realized what the motel had been after all along. It wanted a piece of me, something I could never get back. The air was thick, cold, and suffocating. It was as if I felt the weight of 1,000 reflections, each capturing me in hollow, twisted expressions. Twisted reflections filled every mirror around, their multitude an army of dark-eyed versions of myself. Each was waiting, watching as if it knew something I didn't. The old man moved closer, his eyes unyielding. "You have come this far," he whispered. His words almost drowned out in the soft hum of the mirror. "Now, it's time to give what's been promised." A wave of panic washed over me. Promised? I stepped backward, and the mirrors cut into me, cold as ice. "I didn't promise anything." He tipped his head to one side with a sad, knowing look in his empty eyes. "You promised yourself the instant you stepped into this place. The motel keeps pieces of those who enter. But you have seen more than most." He gestured to the reflections. "You have memories. Memories." The word dropped into my brain, clicked something loose that I couldn't quite reach for. Flashes of my life in the motel flashed through my mind, yet they were wrong-twisted. Images I couldn't place, memories I didn't remember, making shadows, glimpses, parts of a life that didn't exactly feel like mine. "No," I whispered, shaking my head. "No, this isn't real. It's just a building, a place. I can leave." I can. But as I spoke, the reflections leaned forward, their hands splayed against the glass. The pressure in the room increased, the air thick from decaying like something old and forgotten. I could feel them, the weight of their gaze, as if every iteration of myself wanted to pull deeper into the grasp of the motel. "You wanted to see," said the old man. "You wanted to understand. And so you will, if you remember." With those words, the mirrors began to ripple, their surfaces shifting and swirling like water. I could feel it now, the pull, something drawing out of me. And then a memory flashed into my mind, sharp and vivid. I was 6 years old, standing in my childhood home staring at my reflection in a mirror for the first time, trying to understand who I was. But then the memory buckled and warped, twisting into something darker. In its reflection, my face was hollow, my eyes empty, just like the versions of myself surrounding me now. It was a small moment, a piece of my past, but it felt like it was slipping away from me, fading into the darkness. I gasped, reaching out, trying to hold on to it, but it was gone, swallowed by the motel, like it had never happened. The old man's voice drifted over me, quiet and calm. "You'll leave, yes. But not all of you. That's the price." One by one, other memories began to slip from me. Moments from my childhood, fragments of conversations, details of faces and places, all were lost, each one pulled into the mirrors. And I could feel myself growing lighter, emptier, as if pieces of my very identity were being whittled away. I felt panic set in, trying to remember, holding on to whatever I could. But the reflections kept closer and closer, their hands outstretched and eyes wide with the burden of all they'd taken. "You can't take this from me," I shouted, my voice hoarse and desperate. My words didn't reverberate, though the hush of the room swallowed them completely. The old man didn't react, didn't flinch. "It was yours to give. You came here seeking answers, and this is the cost." By then I could barely see, my eyes clouded, head foggy. Faces and names and moments, all of it was slipping away, out of my grasp. I was a shell, empty and weightless, and grasping only the most tenuous edges of my mind for the last shreds of me. I managed to get to my feet one last time, this surge of will sending me clawing out of the room, back into the hallway, fleeing before the motel took what was left. The cold night air bit, nipping, as I staggered out into the open. The sky above was dark and blank, stars hidden behind clouds, as if even the world itself had turned its back. I didn't look back, didn't dare to. The motel loomed in my mind, a shadow pressing down, never truly letting me go. I got into my car, my hands shaking, my head swimming with fractured memories. I tried piecing them together, tried to remember who I was, but it all seemed so scattered, so disconnected. The motel had taken parts from me that I couldn't name, pieces that I didn't even know I'd had. I'd left it, yes, but not all of me had. And with every mile that rolled by, the weight of that emptiness finally settled in, hollow, deep, and filled with a kind of dread I knew I could never shake. The blacktop unwound before me, stark and unrelenting. My hands were clamped to the wheel, the knuckles white, but no amount of clutching could make them feel safe. I felt my brain unraveling, threads of memory slipping away, leaving only impressions and half-baked thoughts in their wake. With each mile I placed between myself and the motel, it should have gotten easier, yet with each one, that feeling of hollowness was nibbling deeper. The old man's words kept playing in my mind, the way his voice was so calm and empty, rang in my head. "You'll leave, yes. But not all of you. That's the price." I couldn't quite remember how I'd made it out, but I knew he was right. I'd left something behind, parts of myself I'd never get back. The headlight beams cut through the darkness, shining down the curving road ahead, but everything felt off, almost foreign. I was some other person's eyes looking out at a world that couldn't feel familiar, though the places and the memories should have. I glanced up into the rearview mirror, expecting to see me staring back, but what looked back was hollow, empty, a twisted reflection like those in the motel mirrors. I turned my head back onto the road, my heart racing. Whatever the motel had taken more than memories, it took a part of myself that was integral, which I could still not quite define, only feel its absence. And the more I tried to remember, the further away it slipped. Eventually, exhaustion prevailed, and I swerved off the road onto a small, abandoned rest stop. The silence was oppressive, the only sound the engine's hum as it cooled. I sat there in the dark, with the great emptiness of night closing in, and for the first time, I felt really alone. I closed my eyes, praying for a moment of peace, but the instant I did, the memories swam to the forefront of my mind again, distorted, fragmented images of the motel, its twisting hallways, and the reflections that watched me, hollow-eyed and silent. Every image seemed a reminder, a tether pulling me back toward something I was in desperate flight from. A soft whisper cut the silence, staying in the car like a cold breeze. I sat up, my heart racing, straining to hear. The sound was faint but unmistakable, a voice calling from somewhere distant, from a place I'd thought I'd left behind. "Come back." My hands shook as they closed over the seat, trying to steady myself. I didn't dare to move, scarcely daring to breathe, yet the whisper was louder, filling the car, echoing in my mind. "Come back." I clamped my hands over my ears, screwing my eyes shut, but the whisper was louder now, its timbre both intimate and alien, like something that knew me well yet hailed from a part of me that was beyond the reach of my conscious mind. I opened my eyes and half turned toward the mirror, half expecting the hollow-eyed reflection that stared back. The glass was blank, though, mirroring nothing but the dark ribbon of road behind. Every time I tried to close my eyes, the whispers returned, growing louder, more insistent. By dawn, I was a shell, drained and hollow, the presence of the motel squatting in every corner of my mind. I knew what it wanted better still, what it had taken. Pieces of myself I could never get back. And somewhere, deep down, I knew that unless I returned, it would never let me go. I tried fighting that feeling, trying to assure myself I could move on, leave the motel behind. But as I sat there in the silence, the realization sank in with weight and inexorable force to think I'd ever be free. I fired the car up and, with a sudden hollow sensation of resignation, turned back the way I'd come. The road lay before me, dark and endless as a tunnel. With every mile it was as if I was being sucked into something inevitable, something from which there was no escape. The drive back to the motel had all the sensations of a descent into something darker than I knew. Closer to the familiar twisting road, a thick fog rolled in and shrouded everything in eerie, muted silence. Even the landscape felt foreign as trees and hills faded to shadow, as even the world was recoiling from the place I was heading to. The motel finally appeared, looming and unlit, against the fog like something from another age. Every fiber in my body screamed at me to turn around, but I was past choice now. The pull was too strong, the need to retrieve whatever it had taken too deep. I parked, turned the engine off, and stepped out. The night swallowed me whole. Inside, the motel felt colder, heavier than before. The air was thick and heavy with the scent of decay, something older, that had been waiting. The lobby was empty, in shadow, yet I could feel it, a presence pressing in from all sides, watching, waiting. Down the hall, I went, with each step loud in the quiet, my heart beginning to pound. Room 12 was at the very far end, the door half open, like an invitation back inside. I gave a push against it and stepped inside, the chill immediately washing over me, thoroughly too familiar. It was as I had left it, broken mirror, dust-covered furniture, the feeling that something dark lurked just beyond sight. Yet this time, the room was all different. The space seemed to vibrate with energy that was almost tangible, as if the motel itself was alive, pulsing with an ancient hunger. I turned to the mirror, expecting the twisted reflection to stare back at me, but the glass was dark, empty. I took another step closer and my breath fogged the surface. Slow to form, an image began to take shape, not my own reflection, but something else. It was a version of me, hollow-eyed and empty, yet somehow more alive than I felt. The figure in the mirror cocked its head to one side. A cold, knowing smile crept over its face. "You came back," it whispered, barely harder than a breath, but its voice filled the room. "You couldn't stay away." I tried to speak, but my voice betrayed me, the words slipping away as I stared deep into those empty eyes. It reached out, slapped its hand upon the glass, and I felt a sudden, sharp pull just as though it were drawing me in, tugging at the threads in my mind, my essence. "You left something behind," it continued, its voice soft and mocking. "And now, you'll never leave." A surge of fear shot through me then, but it was too late. The mirror seemed to ripple, its surface shifting and distorting, and I felt myself being pulled closer, drawn into the reflection, into the darkness that had waited all along. I fought it, digging my nails into the edges of my brain, trying to hold on to myself, but the tug was insistent, the darkness encroaching. Memories flashed before my mind's eyes, fragments of my life, moments so vaguely familiar, were slipping away as I was pulled deeper, swallowed up by the motel's grasp. I knew, then, at the end, when the very last part of me disappeared, that in those final seconds, it was all true. The motel had taken every memory, every fragment of my identity, everything that was stitched together to make me, and left behind an empty shell, a hollow echo in the shadows. And as I disappeared into darkness, the form in the glass took another step, smiling, filling in where I just stood. It pivoted, peering out into the room with those empty eyes glinting darkly with their own satisfaction. It was the motel that had claimed me, just as it had claimed so many others before. Now I was part of it, forever trapped in the shadows, waiting for the next soul to wander in, searching for answers they'd never find. For the motel was patient, and it never forgot.